There are moments in the wild that don't follow any logic you were taught to trust, moments that arrive quietly, between the trees in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, and rearrange something inside you before you even understand what's happening. Ethan Cole didn't know it yet, but this was going to be one of those moments. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of morning that arrives cold and gold in the Blue Ridge foothills, frost still clinging to the low grass, the sky a pale, washed-out blue that feels more like memory than weather. Ethan had driven the same 30 minutes from town, parked at the same gravel pull-off, and laced up the same worn hiking boots he'd been wearing for 6 years. This trail was his ritual, 4.5 miles through second-growth forest, a steady climb to a ridge overlook, then back down before noon. He'd done it so many times that his body moved through it almost automatically. Boots finding the rocks, lungs adjusting to the grade, mind going quiet the way it only could out here. He was about 1.5 miles in when he saw it. Just a flicker at first, movement between the tulip poplars, maybe 40 feet off the trail to his left. He stopped walking, didn't reach for his phone, didn't make a sound. He'd seen deer out here plenty of times, the occasional fox, once a black bear cub that sent his heart into his throat before its mother pulled it deeper into the brush. But this was different. The shape was wrong for a deer, low-slung, broad through the shoulders, moving with a deliberate, almost liquid kind of stillness. And then it stepped into a thin column of morning light, and Ethan saw it clearly. A bobcat. Adult, female, he would guess later, her face wide and angular, the characteristic tufted ears standing sharp against the pale sky behind her. She was maybe 35 feet away, and she was looking directly at him. Ethan's first instinct was to back up slowly. Every reasonable piece of outdoor knowledge he'd ever absorbed told him the same thing. Wild bobcats don't approach people. They're solitary, secretive, almost compulsively avoidant of human contact. If you're lucky enough to glimpse one at all, it's usually a tail disappearing into the brush, here for a breath, gone before you've fully registered what you saw. They do not stand in the open. They do not hold eye contact. This one did both. He took one step backward, careful, deliberate. The bobcat didn't flinch. She stood absolutely still, watching him with an expression that he would later struggle to describe. Not aggressive, not fearful. Something else, something almost focused. Her tail moved once, slowly, then stopped. Ethan held his breath. Then she took 3 steps forward. He felt his pulse spike. Not panic, not yet, but something animal and automatic flooding up from the base of his spine. He raised both hands slowly, made himself look large the way you're supposed to, kept his eyes on her without staring her down. She stopped again, tilted her head, just slightly, just once, and continued watching him. A full minute passed, maybe longer. The forest was so quiet that Ethan could hear his own heartbeat. Then, without any warning, the bobcat turned. She walked 4 or 5 steps deeper into the trees, moving at an angle that carried her slightly up the slope and away from the trail. Then she stopped and turned back. She looked at him. Ethan didn't move. She took 2 more steps, stopped, looked back again. He would replay this moment many times in the weeks that followed, trying to find a rational framework for what happened next, trying to explain to himself why he did what he did. A wild animal, a predator, had been behaving in a way that defied every expectation he had. The reasonable response was to hold his ground, let her move off, and continue down the trail. Report it to the ranger station if he felt concerned. Leave it to people who knew more about wildlife than he did. But there was something in the way she looked back at him. It wasn't a threat. He was certain of that much. There was no posturing, no vocalization, no display of dominance. She wasn't defending territory. She wasn't cornering him. She was, and he knew how this would sound when he tried to say it out loud later, waiting for him. The way a dog waits at the door. The way something desperate and intelligent communicates across the wall of language when it has no other option left. Ethan took a step off the trail. The bobcat moved forward again, then stopped, then looked back.
He followed. They moved like that through the trees for what he estimated was about 80 yards, maybe 100, him picking carefully through the underbrush, her always a short distance ahead, always pausing to confirm he was still there. The slope grew steeper, the light dimmed where the canopy thickened, and then at the base of a wide moss-covered rock formation half hidden by deadfall and dried leaves, the bobcat stopped completely. She didn't look back this time. She looked down. Ethan came up slowly behind her and stopped. He leaned forward, pushing aside a low branch with the back of his forearm, and there, in a shallow hollow beneath the edge of the rock, barely visible, barely moving, its tiny ribcage rising and falling in shallow, uneven pools of air, was a bobcat kitten. It couldn't have been more than 3 weeks old. Its spots were still soft, its eyes crusted nearly shut. One of its back legs was twisted at an angle that made Ethan's stomach drop. It was alive, but only just. Ethan didn't touch the kitten right away. He crouched at the edge of the hollow and stayed still, watching its breathing, shallow, irregular. The tiny chest would rise, pause for a beat too long, then rise again, each cycle feeling like a small negotiation with something that hadn't decided yet which way it would go. The mother bobcat had positioned herself on top of the flat rock above, watching him without sound, not threatening, not retreating, just present in the way that animals are present when they've run out of any other option.
He pulled out his phone. No signal, which didn't surprise him. This part of the trail folded into a narrow valley that had always been a dead zone. He was at least 1.5 miles from the trailhead, and the kitten was in no condition to wait while he hiked out, found reception, and tried to explain to a wildlife rehabilitator exactly where in these woods he was standing. He knew the risks of handling a wild animal. He knew the mother was 6 feet above him and armed in ways he was not. He knew that warming a hypothermic animal too quickly could do more damage than the cold itself. He knew just enough to understand how much he didn't know. But the kitten's breathing changed while he was still deciding. It hitched, one sharp, trembling pull of air, and then went very shallow and very fast, the way breathing sometimes does just before it stops altogether. The mother made a sound then, not a growl, not a hiss, something lower and quieter than either. A sound that Ethan felt more than heard. He took off his outer flannel shirt without thinking. He lined the bottom of the hollow with it, working slowly, keeping his movements small, and his voice a steady, low murmur. Not words exactly, just sound, just the human equivalent of saying, I know, I'm here. He cupped the kitten in both hands as gently as he had ever held anything in his life. It weighed almost nothing. Its fur was damp and cold against his palms. He held it against his chest and stood up. The mother bobcat watched him from the rock. He met her eyes for just a moment, then looked away, the way you're supposed to, the way that says I'm not a threat in the only language that crosses that particular divide. Then he started moving carefully back toward the trail. Every step mattered now. The kitten's life was measured not in hours, but in minutes, and the nearest wildlife rescue was 30 miles away. He made it back to the trailhead in just under 20 minutes. He'd moved faster than he should have on the uneven ground. One hand pressed against his chest where the kitten lay wrapped in flannel, the other arm out for balance. Twice he'd stumbled. Once he'd stopped completely, convinced the tiny breathing had ceased. But when he pulled the fabric back just enough to look, the kitten's nose twitched, and the shallow rhythm continued. Fragile, persistent, like something that hadn't yet received the message that it was supposed to give up. He got a signal bar at the trailhead parking lot. His hands were shaking when he dialed. The wildlife rehabilitator who answered, a woman named Carol who ran a licensed rescue operation 40 minutes north, asked him a rapid series of questions in the calm, practiced tone of someone who had handled exactly this kind of call before. Age estimate, breathing pattern, body temperature, the leg. Ethan answered each one as precisely as he could, his voice steadier than he felt. She told him to keep the kitten against his body heat, to not attempt feeding it anything, to drive to a gas station 12 miles east where the roads were clear, and she would meet him halfway. He drove with one hand on the wheel and one hand on the kitten, Carol met him in the parking lot of a Shell station on Route 11. She was calm and efficient and moved with the particular quiet urgency of someone who knows that speed and stillness are not opposites. She took the kitten from him, unwrapped it carefully, and examined it under the bright fluorescent overhang of the gas station awning, this tiny spotted thing that had started the day in a hollow under a mossy rock and was now blinking slowly under the pallid light of a highway stop. Carol looked up at him. "You got here fast enough," she said. "That matters." It was the simplest thing, 4 words. But something in Ethan's chest came loose when she said them, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been holding since the moment he first saw the kitten's leg, since the moment he'd made the decision to pick it up, since the moment he'd wondered, every step back through those trees, whether he was already too late. He stood in that parking lot for a long moment after Carol drove away, the flannel shirt still in his hands, the cold finally reaching him now that there was nothing left to carry. He thought about the mother bobcat, somewhere back in those trees, watching a trail that had gone quiet, waiting in the only way she knew how. The kitten survived. Carol called him 3 days later to tell him. The leg had been fractured, a clean break, likely from a fall, but it was stable. The hypothermia had been caught in time. She was feeding, which was the first real sign that something in her had decided to stay. Carol had named her Maple, after the ridge where she'd been found. Ethan smiled when he heard that. It felt right. It felt like something earned. He visited once, about 2 weeks in. Carol ran her facility out of a converted barn on a quiet stretch of land north of town, a place of careful, purposeful stillness, where wild things came to remember what they were. Maple was in a small enclosure, warmer now, her eyes fully open and bright with the particular alertness of a predator just beginning to understand its own nature. She was eating on her own, moving on the leg. Carol said she was progressing faster than expected. Ethan stood at the edge of the enclosure and watched her for a long time without saying anything. He thought about the morning it all began, the frost on the grass, the pale October sky, the way the forest had felt ordinary right up until the moment it didn't. He thought about the mother, the way she had walked those careful steps ahead of him, stopping and turning, stopping and turning. He had spent a lot of years in those woods. He thought he understood them, but that morning had quietly dismantled something in his certainty, not in a troubling way, but in the way that genuine humility arrives when you've witnessed something that exceeds your existing categories for the world. Carol told him that if Maple's recovery continued, she would be released near the area where she was found, not guaranteed to reunite with her mother. That wasn't something anyone could promise, but close to her origin, close to the territory that was already coded somewhere deep inside her, as close to home as they could manage. Ethan drove back through the foothills that afternoon with the windows down, the cold air moving through the car, the ridgeline sitting dark and familiar against the early evening sky. He took the long way past the gravel pull-off where he always parked. He didn't stop, but he looked. The tree line sat quiet and still, the way it always did. He didn't see anything moving in the shadows between the trees. But somewhere in the weeks that followed, on the mornings when he returned to the trail and the forest settled back into its familiar silence around